Alright, so this is a quick video explanation of the new general education program, and this presentation is geared towards instructors. So the general education, the 2.0 program applies to transfer degrees. So that takes into account the business studies transfer, criminal justice transfer, health science transfer, liberal studies transfer, math and science transfer, and the visual arts transfer degrees. Now, basically what's going to happen in the Gen Ed 2.0 program is each student is going to be required to take a number of courses. And you see the requirements here: 2 English courses, 1 communications course, 1 quantitative reasoning course, 2 science, 2 humanities and fine arts, and 2 social science. Now we want to emphasize that we don't want to just focus on the courses. When I say a Gen Ed program, we really do mean that. So there's a lot of tie-ins and there's a lot of overlaps with the things that are going to be discussed in these courses. And if you want to know more about that, then talk to some people who have been involved in general education. Now you saw the courses that students have to take, but there are some restrictions. First off, obviously if you take a course, to make it count towards Gen Ed, you have to pass it, and have to pass with a C or better in particular. And in each of those categories that I mentioned, in the English, communication, quantitative reasoning, and so on, there are certain courses which you have to take, or certain collections of courses where you have to take one of them. And each category works a bit differently. But when I say quantitative reasoning, not every single math course is going to count as a quantitative reasoning course. So we're going to look at the categories, and the first category is the English category. Now this is one of the most straightforward categories, because in the English category you have to take 2 courses, and the 2 courses that you need to take, or that students need to take, are the English 111 and English 222. And so if you're an instructor who teaches one of these courses, there's some general education components that go along with these courses. And if you don't know about that, then you should talk to people in your area. Now in the communication category, you have an option. You have an option of taking Speech 101 or Speech 257. So when I say you have, I mean students have. So students will have to take 1 speech course, and it'll be out of these 2. As far as quantitative reasoning goes, there are 3 options to complete the Gen Ed program. And the 3 options are Math 114, which is mathematical reasoning, Math 107, which is college algebra, or Math 212, which is statistics. And I will just mention that these are geared for different populations. The Math 114 is geared for basically students who aren't going into STEM fields and who don't need a lot of extra math. Math 107 is geared towards students who are going into STEM fields. And statistics is geared towards anybody who may need statistics in their future program of study. Now with the natural science, or the science category, you have to take 2 courses. And the way this works is that one of the courses that a student is going to have to take is going to have to come from the Gen Ed intensive list. This is a list of courses, as you can see there, that are basically 100 level science courses. And if they've taken 1 course from the Gen Ed intensive list, they're going to have to take 1 course from the MTA list. Now the MTA list, when I say that, I mean the MTA science list. And so students will have to take 1 course from the Gen Ed intensive list and 1 course from the MTA, or Michigan Transfer Agreement list. The Michigan Transfer Agreement list is determined by the college, and there's a committee that oversees that. Now, in the science, there is two other restrictions in the natural sciences that you should know of. The first is that being the two courses that you pick, one from the Gen Ed intensive list and one from the MTA list, must have different designators. So if you take or if the student takes Bio 100, then in the MTA list, what's going to count is going to be a different designator. So they can't take Bio 100 and 101 and count for the two courses. They'd have to take Bio up here and something like Chem or Physics or Geology or something of that nature in the MTA list. And secondly, in the sciences, one of the courses that they take must have a lab component. And so students are going to have to take one of the Gen Ed intensive lists, one course from the MTA list. They're going to have different designators, and one of them is going to have a lab component. Now, if you look at these courses, the Bio 101, most of these have lab components. So it shouldn't be real difficult to get the lab component in one of the science classes. The Humanities and Fine Arts category works very similarly. You have to take one course from a Gen Ed intensive list, which is the Humanities and Fine Arts Gen Ed intensive list, and one course from the Humanities and Fine Arts MTA list. And these ones also have to have different designators. However, there's no lab component to deal with in the Humanities and Fine Arts. You can see the Gen Ed intensive list there below. And just like the Humanities and Fine Arts, the social science has the same setup. You're going to have to take one course from a Gen Ed intensive list in social science and one course from an MTA list in social science. And again, you're going to have different designators. And again, there's no lab components in social science that you have to worry about. So as long as you have one course from the Gen Ed intensive, well, as long as the student has one course from Gen Ed intensive list and one course from the MTA list in social science, then they've completed the general education portion of the social science requirement. Now, the Gen Ed intensive list does align with the MTA, but it's not the exact same thing as the MTA. So let me just briefly describe. The Michigan Transfer Agreement is basically a credit transfer block, and any schools, any colleges in Michigan which sign on to this are basically guaranteeing that if a student has 30 credits and those credits meet a certain requirement, then that 30 credit hour can transfer in as a block 30 credit hour idea. So here's what we've done. If a student here completes the General Education 2.0, then they will have satisfied the requirements of the Michigan Transfer Agreement. Now, the other way is not necessarily true. They can satisfy the requirements of the Michigan Transfer Agreement and not complete Gen Ed 2.0. So Gen Ed 2.0 guarantees that you satisfy the MTA. But there are also other ways to satisfy the MTA. Now, one of the reasons we didn't make Gen Ed 2.0 the exact same thing as the MTA is because that takes into account just too many courses to assess as a Gen Ed program. And so that's where those Gen Ed intensive lists come from. All of the courses on the Gen Ed intensive list are also MTA courses. So as a Gen Ed program, if you're an instructor and you teach one of those courses, something that's on a Gen Ed intensive list, then there's some assessment pieces that carry along with those courses. So if you teach one of these courses, you should know that there should be some sort of Gen Ed assessment piece that goes along with each. Now, the assessment piece for each course is a little bit is not the exact same for all the courses. So you may ask, how do you assess something? Well, we're using the degree qualifications profile, and the Gen Ed committee, is interested in intellectual skills. And each of the intellectual skills has rubrics up on the Gen Ed website on the intranet. So if you look up the Gen Ed committee on the intranet, then you'll find some documents that link to some documents that are the Gen Ed rubrics for the intellectual skills. And how a particular class assesses their intellectual skills, if you don't know that, then you should consult with people in your area. However, I will say not all classes assess all intellectual skills. So if you're in a math class, then it's going to focus on quantitative reasoning. If you're in a communications class, it probably won't focus on quantitative reasoning. So each of the classes that I had in the previous slide has different intellectual skills tied with them. And to figure out which intellectual skills each class deals with, consult with people in your area. Now, once you know what you're assessing and how to assess it, you will have to report the data. And the way we're going to report data is basically, right now, is that the results are going to go to the general education faculty in your area, whoever is in charge of that. And you're going to report the intellectual skills that you assess to the Gen Ed faculty in your area. And that person should compile all of the data. And the Gen Ed committee is looking at basically the results of the aggregate data. So we don't want to see an individual instructor's results, and we don't want to see an individual class results. We want to see the aggregate data for each of those categories and each of the courses. And once we've compiled all that data, then we'll get a chance to go back and look at it and see how we're doing in the degree qualification profile mappings. So if you do have questions about this, what to assess, how to assess, please talk to whoever's the Gen Ed faculty in your area, those people who have been attending the Gen Ed committees, and talk to the General Education Committee chair if you have any other questions beyond that. Other than that, hope this video helped, and we hope you have great classes. Thanks. Good luck.